Hi, I'm Rebecca Jez, and
Hi, I'm Lauren Ramers.
we're here to talk to you about how to complete the UDL lesson plan template. This template can be used in your methodology courses, for your formal observations in your classroom with your university supervisors, and really to prepare yourself for getting ready for the CalTPA, which is one of the requirements of your program. So what we've done is we've created this template, and then we are going to go through an example so that you can see exactly how to use the template and how to fill in each part. All right, I'm going to take the video off, and so we can really focus on the words. And there we go. Okay. So as you can see, best practice means that you go through and you take a look at your whole class, and then you also look at some of the students who might need those extra supports. So for example, if you have a student who has an IEP, then you're going to want to make sure to list any IEP goals that you would be responsible for as a teacher in that class. It's very important to make sure that you look at the levels and the assets that your students have, and then also their interests and their strengths. So we also ask you to look at resources, what technology access you have, any supplemental materials, and then also some support people that you might have in your class. Content standards. So each content standard, which we use the Common Core content standards in California, you are going to want to identify what it is which standard you're meeting, and then also how it matches to the assets and the needs of your students. Because we have such diversity in language here in California, it is always best practice to include some sort of language standard, which is around reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And then there's also the academic vocabulary. So one of the things that they found is a lot of times students struggle because they don't have the academic vocabulary needed for whatever the task is. So we want you to go through your assignment and just see if there's any sort of vocabulary that you might need to either pre-teach or reteach to make sure that your students are able to do their work. Each one of your assignments should fit within some sort of unit or some sort of bigger picture. So the unit summary is where you explain where this lesson that you actually have here is actually fitting into to an overall larger assignment. And then we have the learning objectives. So this is exactly what the students will be able to do, and then any sort of rationale that's driving your instructional decisions, which we'll go into more when we go into the example. There's 3 types of assessment that we would like to see, which one is the formal assessment, which is the summative. Then there's informal, which is formative. And then we want you to do a student self-assessment. Have the students actually go through and take a look at their work. Now, if you are in a Catholic school, like some of our students in the Academy of Catholic Teaching program, then they also need to include a faith-based learning outcome. So how does your lesson connect with the mission of the church, a faith-based message, or a service learning that promotes Catholicism? If you're not in the ACT program, then that wouldn't necessarily need to be done, and so that's why it's in red as well. So then when you look at the structure of a universal design for learning activity, and remember, universal design for learning is when the teacher is being proactive about how they design their lessons and in designing lessons based on the students and the setting and the supports that are needed. And so all these lessons need to have multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression. So you want to write how you're actually using these different means of engagement, representation, and expression during your language or during your lesson. So just to kind of go over, we've got 4 columns: materials, sequence of events, instructional strategies, and inclusive practices to support all learners. And then we have the traditional anticipatory set, instruction, guided practice, closure, and independent practice. So in here, the materials that you might be using are the visuals that you would have, any sort of digital resources. This could be websites, it could be videos or links, that type of thing. Any handouts that you might be giving to students. Assistive technology. So for example, if you have a student who uses a laptop instead of writing, then you would want to also list that and making sure that you have that all ready and prepared before you start the lesson. Any sort of supplemental material, so this could be workbooks that go with the textbook that the district's adopted, or this could be, you know, in a science class, maybe some rocks or examples of geology or that type of thing. Could be graphic organizers, and then there's many, many others. The sequence of the lesson, that's the steps that you're taking to make sure that you are, you have academic rigor, you're building vocabulary, and you're meeting whatever the standards that you chose are. Instructional strategies, these are just a few that we listed here, but the grouping, so are you doing whole group, small group, pairs, individual? Differentiation of instruction, so have you given maybe sentence starters to students who struggle with starting writing? Did you give maybe a word bank, that type of thing? Maybe you have less problems for a student to do. And then scaffolding, so you've maybe given them a graphic organizer on how to write an essay, or you have them working with the paraprofessional in the room. You'll want modeling, you want to check for understanding, maybe you have different instructional supports, maybe you have the students asking questions or creating a question list or that type of thing. And then the inclusive practices are really to support your diverse learners. So the categorized diverse learners are like the English language learners, the students with IEPs, a student with a 504 plan, or a GATE student. But you also have other diverse learners that are a little bit more hidden, and these might be in foster care, or have dealt with bullying, or homeless, or that type of thing. So, you know, really keeping these students in mind before you go through and teach the lesson while you're doing your planning. So, and then you fill this out. So some of the questions we have you keep in mind with the anticipatory set is, how will you activate your learners' prior knowledge and engage them in the topic? For instruction, it's how will you demonstrate academic rigor, vocabulary development, and application of the knowledge. Guided practice is how will you model the lesson visually, auditorily, hands-on. Closure is how will you assess the learner, what needs to be supported further, any sort of scaffolding, reteaching, additional examples. How will you explicitly demonstrate the connection between this lesson and the next steps of the unit? And then also the independent practice. So how will the students express that they've actually obtained the information taught and have met the standard? The final piece is the reflection, and after every lesson, and actually after every day when I'm teaching, I usually sit down and try to think about, okay, well, how did the execution of the lesson go, and what can I do differently next time? So in order to prepare you for the TPEs, we're using similar questions that they use for their reflection, and getting you started on thinking about your lesson in a little bit more depth. So how did learning in depth about your students prepare you? So that's that class analysis for planning the lesson. What monitoring strategies did you use? What adaptations did you make? And any changes that you would make to the assessments are throughout the lesson. And then also what TPEs provided the foundation for the academic and social achievement. For the TPEs, those are teacher performance expectations, and those are basically a list of elements that you have to demonstrate in order for you to get your teaching credential. All right, so now Lauren's going to actually go through UDL lesson plan, or Ann and I are going to go through the UDL lesson plan example that we put together, and in fact, I will put example here because we're not on the template. Okay, so go ahead, Lauren.
Awesome. So we did a detailed analysis of our students, and we chose 11 of them to look at.
We did
14.
14 of them.
We did 14. And what we first looked at was what their Lexile levels were and what the grade level equivalent was for that. We listed what we know about the students currently, their personal interests, and some strengths that they bring to the classroom setting. And then we made detailed notes about things that they need. So you can see that there are some examples that Dr. Jez referenced earlier. You see some EL levels in there. And then we also included some links down in the footnotes so that if you have any questions about what to put in those boxes, you can go to those links. And so right now we're going to go to the Lexile grade level conversion chart. You can see when you have a student's particular Lexile level, in general, what that would convert to in terms of grade level.
Another one that we have in there is, let me just pull this up, is the Elpac. And they are now using this when they're looking at the California English Language Development. And so this will help you in your planning to find out, if you have an English language learner, then, what type of supports do they need and what you can do there. Another one that we put in here is on the ACEs. So we had one student that we said, we know he has a high ACEs score. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and there can be a lot of different things that give someone a higher ACEs score. And it could be how they were brought up. Oh, here's some examples. So physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, household with mental illness, domestic violence, parental divorce or separation, substance abuse, or incarceration. For our made-up class, we have a student that might have a high ACEs score. So we know that although we might not know which of these factors would have caused that, we at least know that there's many things that were going on in that child's life that could affect them.
Notice also that for students who have an IEP, we actually listed the goal. The reason that we did that, it was to help remind us, the teachers in the classroom, to be attentive to that particular goal, to check in on the student, to monitor their progress, specifically using their IEP goal.
All right, and then also I want to point out that we do have their interests in there. So as you're planning a lesson, you can integrate, for example, for student number 8, hip hop dancing and rhythm. And so, we're going to talk about dance or poetry and how it has a rhythm. And, another thing that might have it is dancing. Can anyone tell us about that? And, it allows for that student who also has an emotional disturbance and a behavior support plan to actually highlight some of the things that they actually feel really good about. And so that's a nice way that you can plan for your students. I also want to point out that we did not use student names. We used their IDs. So we did keep within confidentiality of the students. So. All right, so the other thing we looked at was the support people. And in this class, we have a special education paraprofessional who is there daily, and also the EL teacher who once a week gives some sort of consultation.
We're going to be using Google Classroom for the students during this particular reading and writing lesson today. We're also going to be using sentence templates to help students with the crafting of their sentences. And then we have access to a digital poem called Salvador Late or Early.
That gives music. It actually has the print and pictures, so the student's really able to engage with the poetry on a different level rather than just looking at paper with writing on it.
So let's take a look at the standards that are going to be addressed. These are 7th grade standards from Common Core. We pulled 3 standards from reading and 2 from writing. We're going to be taking a look at the theme or central idea from a text and analyzing how it's developed over the course of the text. We're going to be taking a look at how to determine words and phrases as they are used in text, and specifically engaging with figurative meanings, especially because this is poetry, taking a look at rhyme, rhythm, repetition of sounds, and the use of metaphor. And then the last reading standard we're going to look at is analyzing how a poem's form or structure contributes to its meaning. Then once we have done some reading and analysis of the poem, we'll move into the writing standards, where students will be asked to write a personal narrative. They'll develop that narrative using Salvador Late or Early as a mentor text, focusing on relevant descriptive details and the precision of word choice and phrases and the use of metaphor to help convey the experience or event.
As I mentioned before, language support is really important. So also we have the links to the Common Core, and then we here have the link to the language support. So English Language Development Standards, and you can see this is kindergarten through grade 12. So you can find out what those are, but most of them are around reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And so we identified the Reading and Listening 1, B6, Part 1, which is interpreting the meaningful ways, B, which is interpretive, 6, which is reading closely literary and informational text and viewing multimedia to determine how meaning is conveyed explicitly and implicitly through language. Then the academic vocabulary, the use of metaphor, action verbs, sensory language. And then Lauren actually went through the poem and came up with the words that she thought, you know what, these might be the words that the students aren't as familiar with. And so really analyzing the text before you give it to students is a helpful way to make sure that you're supporting them, and then identifying those vocabulary words.
Every single lesson will always have a place in a bigger unit that you are developing. So this particular lesson fits at the beginning of the school year. It is a lesson designed to help you get to know the students personally. And so there are several goals here. First, we want to understand the strengths and areas of growth that students have with respect to analyzing fictional text and their ability to use precise sensory language and details in their narrative writing. It's the first lesson in a 2 to 3 day sequence that allows students to read and analyze the poem Salvador Late or Early by Sandra Cisneros. And then we're going to use that poem as a mentor text to write an introductory narrative piece. Students will describe a particular time of day where they will share what their actions are, and that will help us as teachers to get to know both a little bit more about their own personal lives, but also about their ability to use language.
I also want to point out really quickly that you'll notice that 2 of the students, we don't have any information for them. This is also a working document. You're going to have students that all of a sudden pop into your classroom, and you can find out their strengths or interests. You can get some sort of page printout of their Lexile scores, but then really getting to know what their needs are might take time. And so this being something, because you will use this lesson plan once you do a class analysis as a working document that you develop over time, then really allowing for this to also unfold as the class goes on. And so using an assignment like this, you might be able to learn about another need or another bit of information that might help you when you're planning at later times.
All right, so let's move into the learning objectives section of this lesson plan. We hope that students will be able to analyze a text's sensory language and use of metaphors, and then use that text as a mentor to write their own introductory narrative.
And notice that these go back with actually the content standards. So we're using the standards to drive what the students will be able to know. The rationale, this actually comes from your coursework here at USD. This is where you'll be learning about the different research and theoretical frameworks. So we chose 2 that we were going to focus on for this, which is The Culturally Responsive Teaching by Geneva Gay, and then there's also a book by Hammond in 2015. And then Write Like This, Teaching Real-World Writing Through Modeling and Mentor Text by Gallagher. So, if there's something that you learn in your literacy class, then you can, be like, oh yeah, who was that? And, how can you start making sure that you're bringing these research-based practices into your classroom and into your lesson design?
So let's talk about assessments. You need to know how you're going to assess your students and their learning before you launch into the lesson. There's 3 pieces of assessment that are needed. The first is the formal or the summative assessment. So in this particular lesson, we're going to ask students to submit a final draft of an introductory narrative. Again, they've used Salvador Late or Early as a mentor text, and they have their writing prompt, and then they will be working through the writing process and submitting that final draft as their summative assessment. Throughout the entire process, 2-3 days, however long it takes you to work through the lessons and help students along the way, there will be informal or formative assessments. For instance, in the lesson today, you'll be examining the notes that students take on the text when you're chunking the poem. There will be classroom discussions of the text. There will be some pre-writing activities, and then various drafts using sentence frames from the mentor text. All of those things will tell you what supports students need to move forward in the progress of their activity. And then at the end, there will be a student self-assessment. So students are going to evaluate their own work using the writing process, and we have a rubric for them called the 5 stages of writing. After they do a self-assessment, they will identify a writing goal. So for example, perhaps we have a student who didn't quite get to the finish line. Maybe they didn't turn in that final draft. So their goal for the next writing assignment would be to submit a final draft that is proofed and ready for teacher assessment.
All right. The next part is only for the ACT candidates, the Academy of Catholic Teaching. So if you're working in a Catholic school, then one of the things you want to think about is how you integrate the mission of the church, faith-based messages, or service learning that promotes Catholicism. So we went to the National Catholic Standards and Benchmarks website, and we chose one that looked at the role models of faith and service for social justice. And then the connection we made was with Joshua. So you can go through and kind of take a look at how you can be thinking about your faith-based learning outcomes as well, and make sure that those are in there. So next we're going to jump right into, remember this is just to help you remind you what each one of these columns is. So now we're going to jump into the actual lesson.
All right, so we begin this lesson with an anticipatory set where we ask the students about any younger brothers or sisters that they might have. If they don't, maybe they're only children, maybe they have cousins, or they can make a connection with a neighborhood child. And we want them to tap into their reservoir of responsibility. So poll the class on what types of responsibilities they have with respect to these younger children in their lives. After the poll, you'll partner students up where they have some pair share discussions about those responsibilities. And then at the end of those pair share discussions, you'll ask from the whole class 3 ideas to share, which summarizes their conversations. This allows for you then to introduce the poem and make the connections to those anchors in their brain, Salvador, Late, or Early.
And notice the instructional strategies are whole class, think, pair, share, and then back to whole class. For the inclusive practices to support all learners, we've got the sentence starters on the board to help with communication during the pair share, and then also providing examples if needed.
All right, moving on to the instructional steps. We'll begin with identifying those vocabulary words that you saw earlier from the text. We'll put those vocabulary words on the board or PowerPoint, and we're going to use pictures to support our EL students especially, but all students really, because many of the words are probably going to be new to them. The teacher will choose 2 words to model word clusters, and then using inquiry strategies determine how well the students understand the words and create those word clusters on the board. Then we'll break students up into small groups, and they will create word clusters using the remaining vocabulary words, and then all of those words will go onto the word wall. So notice that we have note cards ready for that. Students can write their words on the note cards and put them up on the word wall during the lesson.
Once again, we do the whole class, small group, and then we've got visual vocabulary with pictures to illustrate the meanings.
During guided practice, we're going to use critical reading strategies, and we're going to have the students read the poem out loud at least 3 times. The goal here is that they build their comprehension after each read. And so after each read, we ask the students, what do we learn about Salvador during this read? The first read is going to be a clean read. We're just going to read it out loud and then ask the question, what do we learn about Salvador during this read? We'll read out loud a second time, and during that particular read, students will circle words that they're not yet familiar with. Again, we'll ask the question, what do we learn about Salvador during this read? And hopefully students' understanding of who Salvador is and his actions will increase. Then we'll do a third read where we will box Salvador's actions and underline any sensory language and metaphors. The third read will probably require us to have a little bit more discussion. And this is where, as a teacher, I might model what I'm thinking as I read a chunk of the text to show the students what's happening in my brain as I analyze the text and think about Salvador. Then we'll have students do some pair share work and some whole class discussion about the poem so that there's even deeper comprehension about what is going on. I would also encourage students to either work with a partner or even on their own to finish marking the poem with those circles, boxes, and underlines. So notice the strategies that we've used over here include critical reading strategies where they're marking the text, pair sharing to discuss. They might do some independent work as they're finishing to mark the text. As a teacher, I'm going to be modeling what I'm thinking, how I'm reading. And then we're going to use visualize and list as a strategy after the poem is read, where they're going to actually visualize a new setting of their own in their own life. And that will begin the process of drafting a poem that will introduce themselves to the teacher. Before we jump into that, though, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Sorry about that. We have one more support that I think will really help students to understand the poem, and that is to watch the digital poem. Now, some of you might want to jump into watching the digital poem first, to make sure that students understand the poem right from the beginning. But we have it after the third read, because really this lesson is not about visual literacy. It's actually about analysis of a text. So use the digital poem after you've had the students read and discuss the poem several times, and that'll just help to cement their learning. After the digital poem is viewed, you can teach them how to chunk the poem and continue to clarify how they might mark the text to help them comprehend better. Then we'll move into the visualization step of this particular lesson. They're going to visualize a time during their day that they want to share with their teacher. So that time of day could be before school, during school, at recess, at lunch, after school, or in the evening. And that time of day should communicate something important to the writer's life that they're willing to share with the teacher and with each other, because they will be engaging in writer's workshops. So they're going to have to be comfortable sharing this particular part of their life with other people. You'll ask the students to create a list of action words that describe what they do during that particular period of the day within that setting. And then you will teach them about how we use mentor texts to draft our own writing. This idea that we use really expert writers as mentors during the time when we become writers, as we're emerging our writing skills, is really important.
And the part that we have down here in red, that goes for the ACT students. So how else can we use mentors in our lives? So really starting to make that personal and spiritual connection at this point. I also want to point out that here we have informal check to see if student number 10 has used questioning strategies during the reading and then reminding that student about that practice. So if we go back up to our class analysis, you can see number 10, she or he has an IEP for specific learning disabilities, and using questioning strategies is one of the IEP goals. So thinking about ways that you can continually assess your special education students formally and informally as well is really important.
Right. So how will we close this lesson? We definitely will want to hear from students towards the end of the lesson to see how far they've come with their drafting. So we'll ask them to pair share what they have written so far with a peer. This lesson will continue over the next day or two as students engage in the rest of the writing process to get towards a more formal piece of writing to turn in. This will also help you as a teacher to determine who's going to need more scaffolding. Maybe the next day you might have small writing groups where you're doing some more direct instruction with students who struggled with the process. What is important is that students need to know exactly what they need to complete by the end of the day. So we recommend that you create a task list for those students. For instance, for this particular day, they need to be sure that they've identified a setting, a time of day that they're going to write about, and that they have a list of actions that occur during that particular day. This will ensure that when they come in the next day for the next lesson, they'll be able to sit down and start the drafting process.
And then in the independent practice section, we are having the students continue to work on their drafting and their narrative poem over the next few days, but using, reminding them about the 5-stage writing process rubric and the fact that they may have to write a goal after they've reflected on how they've been doing. And so we're giving them that time to really think about themselves and their progress. So. And then the final piece is reflection. Now remember the teacher performance expectations and the CalTPA and also good practice and the California standards on the teaching profession all focus on teachers becoming critical reflectors of their own practice. And so this is really where you go through and you say, okay, how did the execution of this lesson go? So we have the questions up here and then we've answered them in complete sentences. So by learning about the student prior to the lesson, oh, a comma needs to go there, I was able to plan for different types of family structures and purposefully work on the IEP goals for some students. The monitoring strategies used were to check in about what they learned and how their learning expanded after each reading of the poem. I made sure to talk to the students about the process of how I analyzed the poetry in my head, metacognition. To make the learning work for all students, I provided more examples for some of the learners. For example, one student is an only child, and I asked if he had any extended family or neighbors who he was responsible for at any time. The changes I need to make in the future is that some students struggle to get started on their writing, so I could make sure to have more examples at different levels and additional guidance. And then the TPEs that were used were around engaging and supporting students and planning instruction and designing learning experiences for all students. And then we gave specific examples of each one of these pieces. So that's in the reflective process. You won't necessarily remember what happened 2 weeks ago. So actually taking time to really think about, okay, this is what worked, this is what didn't, and this is where I need to kind of go from here is an important piece. So good luck on your lesson planning, and we will have all these materials for the template and everything else available for you. And of course, your university supervisors and faculty instructors should be able to support you as well. Thank you.